The mirror doesn't lie, even when we desperately want it to. Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom of his cramped apartment, watching a stranger look back at him. 32 years old, shoulders hunched forward from years of apologizing for his existence, eyes that had long since stopped meeting their own gaze. This was the face of a man who had mastered the art of being forgettable, invisible, ignorable. But something had shifted in the past week. A conversation with his younger sister had shattered the comfortable delusion he'd been living in. "Marcus," she had said, her voice gentle but unflinching, "when was the last time anyone asked for your opinion? When was the last time you walked into a room and people noticed?" The questions had haunted him because he couldn't answer them. Not honestly. The journey from invisible to unignorable doesn't begin with grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It begins with a single, devastating realization: the person you've been protecting all these years, the weak, accommodating, perpetually apologetic version of yourself, is the very thing standing between you and the life you actually want. Marcus had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of smallness. He spoke in whispers, dressed to blend in, and had opinions so mild they could barely be called preferences. He was the human equivalent of beige wallpaper, present but utterly forgettable. This wasn't humility, it was cowardice dressed up in socially acceptable clothing. The first habit that changes how people see you isn't about what you add to your life, it's about what you're willing to destroy. You must develop the courage to eliminate the weak self that has been your default mode of operation. This means identifying every behavior, thought pattern, and response that keeps you small and systematically dismantling them. Marcus began with his posture. For years, he had carried himself like someone who was perpetually sorry for taking up space. His shoulders rolled forward, his head hung slightly down, and he walked with the hesitant gait of someone who wasn't sure he belonged wherever he was going. The physical transformation started with a simple rule: every time he caught himself slouching, he would immediately straighten his spine as if someone had attached strings to the top of his head and was pulling him toward the ceiling. The second habit emerged naturally from the first: claiming space with intention. Weak people apologize for their presence. They make themselves small, speak quietly, and move through the world as if they're borrowing time and space from their betters. Marcus began practicing what he called purposeful presence. When he entered a room, he would pause for just a moment at the threshold, square his shoulders, and walk in as if he had every right to be there, because he did. This wasn't about arrogance or aggression. It was about recognizing that taking up space isn't selfish, it's honest. When you carry yourself with intention, when you move through the world as if you belong there, people notice. Not because you're demanding attention, but because confidence has its own gravitational pull. The third habit cut deeper, developing an unshakable personal code. Marcus realized that his weakness stemmed from having no firm principles to anchor him. He bent with every wind, agreed with every opinion, and changed his positions based on who was in the room. This flexibility, which he had mistaken for agreeableness, was actually a form of betrayal, a betrayal of his own core self. He spent a weekend writing down his non-negotiables. What did he actually believe in? What lines would he never cross? What values were so fundamental to his identity that he would defend them regardless of social cost? The exercise was harder than expected because he had spent so long adapting to others' expectations that he had lost touch with his own authentic beliefs. The list that emerged was surprisingly short but absolutely clear: honesty, even when it was uncomfortable; respect for others' time and attention; a commitment to excellence in whatever he chose to do; and the courage to stand alone when necessary. These weren't revolutionary principles, but they became the foundation for everything that followed. The fourth habit was perhaps the most difficult: learning to disagree gracefully but firmly. Weak people avoid conflict at all costs, even when the cost is their own integrity. Marcus had spent years nodding along with opinions he disagreed with, laughing at jokes he found offensive, and supporting decisions he thought were wrong. This people-pleasing had earned him a reputation as nice, but nice isn't the same as respected. He began practicing what he called respectful resistance. When someone expressed a viewpoint he disagreed with, instead of nodding and changing the subject, he would say something like, "I see it differently. Here's my perspective." This wasn't about being argumentative or contrary, it was about being authentic. People respect authenticity, even when they disagree with your position. The fifth habit addressed his relationship with his own voice. Literally. Marcus had trained himself to speak softly, to hedge his statements with qualifiers, and to end declarations with questioning upticks as if seeking permission to have an opinion. He began practicing speaking with what he called quiet authority, not shouting or dominating conversations, but speaking clearly, definitively, and without apology. This meant eliminating weak language from his vocabulary. Instead of "I kind of think maybe we should," he began saying "I believe we should." Instead of "sorry, but could I possibly," he said "I'd like to." The changes seemed small, but the cumulative effect was profound. When you speak like someone who expects to be heard, people listen. The sixth habit challenged his relationship with silence. Weak people fill silence with nervous chatter, desperate to smooth over any moment that might feel awkward. Marcus learned to embrace strategic silence. When someone asked him a question, he would pause before responding, considering his words carefully. When conversations reached natural lulls, he would let them breathe instead of rushing to fill the space with meaningless commentary. Silence, used properly, is a form of power. It suggests confidence, thoughtfulness, and the belief that what you eventually say will be worth the wait. People lean in during strategic silences. They pay attention. They remember what comes after. The seventh habit was about his relationship with his own mistakes. Weak people catastrophize errors, apologize excessively, and allow single failures to define their self-worth. Marcus began treating mistakes as data rather than disasters. When he made an error, he would acknowledge it clearly, explain what he learned from it, and outline specific steps to prevent similar issues in the future. Then, he would move on. This approach to failure is magnetic because it's so rare. Most people either deny their mistakes or grovel about them endlessly. Someone who can acknowledge error without shame while demonstrating growth stands out dramatically in a world of defensive fragility. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. There were days when Marcus felt like he was acting, playing a role that didn't quite fit. There were moments when he questioned whether this new version of himself was authentic or just another performance. But, gradually, he began to notice changes in how others responded to him. Colleagues who had never asked his opinion suddenly sought his input on projects. Friends began including him in decisions they had previously made without consulting him. Strangers held eye contact longer, smiled more readily, and seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. The most surprising change was in his own internal experience. He found himself thinking more clearly, making decisions more quickly, and feeling more energetic throughout the day. It was as if carrying himself with intention had somehow organized his internal world as well. His thoughts became sharper, his emotions more stable, and his sense of purpose more defined. This internal shift revealed an important truth: the way you present yourself to the world isn't just about managing others' perceptions, it's about programming your own mind. When you act with confidence, your brain begins to believe you actually are confident. When you speak with authority, you start to trust your own judgment more completely. The external changes create internal changes, which reinforce the external changes in an upward spiral of development. The eighth habit emerged from this realization: developing what Marcus called selective availability. Weak people are always available to everyone for everything, treating their time as infinitely renewable and their attention as worthless. Marcus began protecting both his time and his mental energy with the same care he would protect valuable possessions. This didn't mean becoming antisocial or uncooperative. It meant being strategic about where he invested his most precious resources. He began saying no to requests that didn't align with his priorities, declining invitations that would drain rather than energize him, and choosing his commitments based on their potential for meaningful impact rather than social obligation. The paradox of selective availability is that it makes you more valuable to others, not less. When someone's time is scarce, their attention becomes precious. When you know someone doesn't say yes to everything, their yes carries more weight. Marcus found that people began appreciating his contributions more when those contributions weren't guaranteed. The friend who always showed up to every gathering became less special than the friend who chose carefully which events deserved his presence. The colleague who always volunteered for every project became less valued than the one who selected assignments based on strategic importance. The ninth habit was perhaps the most subtle but powerful: developing genuine curiosity about others while maintaining clear boundaries about yourself. Weak people either overshare desperately, hoping that vulnerability will create connection, or they remain so closed off that they're essentially unknowable. Marcus learned to ask better questions, listen more intently, and remember details about others' lives and interests. But he also learned to be selective about what he shared in return. Instead of dumping his entire emotional history on anyone who would listen, he began revealing aspects of himself strategically, creating a sense of depth without sacrificing mystery. People are drawn to those who seem to have layers, who reveal themselves gradually rather than all at once. This approach to social interaction created a dynamic that Marcus had never experienced before. People began working to earn his attention and approval rather than the other way around. They would share more, try harder to impress him, and seek his validation. Not because he was manipulating them, but because he had made himself genuinely interesting, someone worth knowing better. The 10th habit addressed his relationship with his own achievements. Weak people either downplay their successes to avoid seeming arrogant, or they overcompensate by bragging desperately about minor accomplishments. Marcus learned to acknowledge his achievements with quiet confidence, neither hiding them nor overselling them. When someone complimented his work, instead of deflecting with "Oh, it was nothing" or "I just got lucky," he would simply say "Thank you. I'm pleased with how it turned out." When discussing projects he had completed successfully, he would mention them matter-of-factly as part of the relevant context rather than either burying them in false modesty or highlighting them with desperate pride. This balanced approach to personal achievement creates an impression of competence without arrogance. People respect those who own their successes while remaining gracious about them. They're drawn to individuals who clearly have accomplishments but don't need constant validation about them. As these first 10 habits began to integrate into Marcus's daily behavior, he noticed that the changes were becoming less conscious and more automatic. His posture had improved so consistently that slouching now felt uncomfortable. He spoke with authority without thinking about it. He maintained appropriate boundaries without internal struggle. The new behaviors were becoming his new normal. But he also realized that destruction of the weak self was only the beginning. Creating an unignorable presence required more than eliminating weakness; it demanded building something compelling in its place. The habits he had developed had cleared the foundation, but now he needed to construct something magnificent on that solid ground. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already done the hardest work himself. He has faced his own mediocrity, acknowledged his own cowardice, and chosen transformation over comfort. External criticism loses its power over someone who has already conducted the most thorough and honest assessment of his own character. Marcus looked in the mirror again, 3 months after beginning this transformation. The face looking back was the same, but everything else had changed. The posture was straighter, the gaze steadier, the overall presence more substantial. This wasn't a performance anymore, this was who he was becoming. But he understood now that becoming unignorable wasn't about demanding attention or forcing others to notice him. It was about becoming the kind of person who naturally commands respect, interest, and genuine regard. It was about building a life so intentional, so authentic, and so compelling that ignoring it would be impossible. The foundation was solid now. The weak self had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something stronger, clearer, and more authentic. But this was only the beginning of the transformation. The next phase would require building upon this foundation something even more powerful, a magnetic presence that drew people in not through manipulation or performance, but through the irresistible force of authentic excellence. The conference room fell silent as Marcus finished presenting his quarterly analysis. Not the uncomfortable silence of boredom or confusion, but the expectant silence of people waiting to hear more. 6 months ago, his presentations had been exercises in managed mediocrity, accurate data delivered in a forgettable monotone to colleagues who checked their phones and planned their lunch orders while he spoke. Today, the same colleagues leaned forward, asked follow-up questions, and referenced his insights in later discussions. The transformation from invisible to influential had required more than simply destroying his weak self. That demolition had created space, but space alone doesn't command attention. Building an unignorable presence meant constructing something magnetic in that cleared foundation, a way of being that naturally drew people in and made them want to stay engaged. The 11th habit had emerged gradually as Marcus realized that truly compelling people don't just avoid being boring, they actively cultivate fascination. This wasn't about becoming a performance artist or developing an artificial persona. Instead, it meant becoming genuinely interested in the world around him and developing the ability to share that interest in compelling ways. Marcus began what he called curiosity cultivation. Every day, he would identify something new to learn about, explore, or understand more deeply. It might be a historical event, a scientific principle, a cultural practice, or a professional skill. The goal wasn't to become an expert in everything but to develop the habit of continuous intellectual growth and the ability to find genuine fascination in unexpected places. This practice transformed his conversations. Instead of relying on weather talk and generic pleasantries, he could contribute genuine insights, ask thoughtful questions, and share interesting perspectives. People began seeking him out not just for his professional expertise but for the engaging conversations they knew they would have with him. The key was authenticity. Marcus wasn't performing interest, he was genuinely developing it. When someone mentioned a topic he had recently explored, his enthusiasm was real. When he asked questions, he actually wanted to hear the answers. This genuine curiosity created a magnetic dynamic. People felt truly heard and understood when talking with him, which made them want to continue the conversation. The 12th habit focused on what Marcus termed strategic storytelling. He observed that people who commanded attention weren't necessarily those with the most dramatic experiences but those who could extract meaning and engagement from ordinary events. They understood how to structure narratives, create emotional connection, and deliver insights that resonated beyond the immediate story. Marcus began paying attention to the stories he told himself about his daily experiences. Instead of simply cataloging events, he looked for the underlying patterns, the unexpected lessons, and the broader implications. When a project at work went sideways, instead of just complaining about the frustration, he would explore what the experience revealed about communication, planning, or human nature. This shift in perspective made him a more engaging conversationalist and a more valuable colleague. His stories weren't just entertainment, they contained insights that others could apply to their own situations. People began remembering his anecdotes and referencing them weeks later because the stories carried weight beyond their surface details. The 13th habit addressed his relationship with expertise. Weak people often pretend to know more than they do or avoid situations where their knowledge gaps might be exposed. Marcus took the opposite approach. He became comfortable with the phrase, "I don't know, but I'd like to learn more about that." This honest acknowledgement of knowledge limitations, combined with genuine curiosity about learning, created an unexpected form of authority. People respected his intellectual humility and trusted his insights more because they knew he wasn't faking expertise. When he did speak definitively about something, they knew it was based on actual knowledge rather than bluffing. He also began developing what he called informed opinions, positions based on research, experience, and thoughtful consideration rather than knee-jerk reactions or inherited beliefs. When discussing complex topics, he could present multiple perspectives while clearly articulating his own position and the reasoning behind it. This balanced approach made people want to hear his thoughts on various subjects because they knew they would get nuanced, well-considered responses. The 14th habit was revolutionary in its simplicity. Marcus learned to give people his complete attention when they were speaking to him. In a world where most conversations happen while people simultaneously check phones, scan rooms for more interesting interactions, and prepare their own responses, undivided attention had become a rare and precious gift. This meant more than just making eye contact. Marcus trained himself to listen for understanding rather than for opportunities to respond. He would ask follow-up questions that demonstrated he had actually absorbed what was being said. He would remember details from previous conversations and reference them appropriately in later interactions. The impact was immediate and profound. People began describing conversations with Marcus as unusually satisfying, though they couldn't always articulate why. They felt heard, understood, and valued in a way that was increasingly rare in their daily interactions. This quality of attention became one of his most distinctive characteristics. The 15th habit emerged from his growing understanding of personal energy management. Marcus realized that truly magnetic people aren't just interesting, they're energizing to be around. They leave others feeling more optimistic, more capable, and more excited about their own possibilities. This required careful attention to his own energy state and its impact on others. Marcus began tracking which activities, people, and environments energized him versus those that drained him. He noticed that when he was operating from a place of genuine enthusiasm and vitality, others responded more positively to him. When he was depleted or forcing engagement, the interaction felt hollow for everyone involved. He began treating his energy as a strategic resource, protecting it carefully and investing it wisely. This meant declining commitments that would leave him depleted during important interactions. It meant scheduling demanding conversations when he was at his best rather than squeezing them into leftover time. It meant recognizing that his internal state was as important as his external presentation. The 16th habit addressed his relationship with conflict and difficult conversations. Weak people avoid these interactions entirely or handle them so poorly that they create more problems than they solve. Marcus developed what he called compassionate directness, the ability to address difficult topics with clarity and kindness but without compromise. This meant learning to separate the person from the behavior, the relationship from the issue, and his emotions from the facts. When someone's performance was inadequate, he could address the performance gaps without attacking their character. When someone disagreed with his position, he could explore the disagreement without taking it personally. This skill made him invaluable in team settings. People knew that Marcus would address problems directly rather than letting them fester, but they also knew he would do so fairly and constructively. Colleagues began bringing their own difficult situations to him because they trusted his ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. The 17th habit was perhaps the most sophisticated, developing what Marcus called positive unpredictability. Boring people are completely predictable, you know exactly how they'll respond in any situation. Unstable people are unpredictably negative, they might explode, withdraw, or create drama without warning. But compelling people are unpredictably positive, they might surprise you with an unexpected insight, an unusual solution, or an act of generous kindness. Marcus began cultivating this quality by occasionally doing things that were characteristically thoughtful but unexpectedly creative. He might bring a book recommendation that perfectly matched someone's interests to a casual conversation. He might propose an innovative solution to a problem that had been frustrating the team for weeks. He might remember someone's mentioned passion and share a relevant article months later. These gestures weren't calculated or manipulative. They emerged from his growing practice of paying attention, thinking creatively, and acting on generous impulses. The unpredictability made interactions with him more interesting because people never quite knew what valuable surprise might emerge. The 18th habit focused on his relationship with failure and setbacks. Most people either hide their struggles entirely or complain about them endlessly. Marcus developed a third approach. He became someone who could acknowledge difficulties while maintaining forward momentum and extractive learning from every setback. When a project failed or a relationship ended badly, Marcus would process the experience privately first, identifying what he could learn and what he might do differently in the future. Then, when discussing the situation with others, he could present it as part of his ongoing development rather than as a disaster or a source of ongoing resentment. This approach to failure made him a safe person for others to confide in about their own struggles. They knew he wouldn't judge them or offer empty platitudes, but would help them extract value from difficult experiences. His office became an informal counseling space where colleagues would bring their professional and personal challenges for perspective. The 19th and final habit was the most important. Marcus learned to operate from a place of authentic self-approval rather than seeking validation from others. This didn't mean becoming arrogant or dismissive of feedback. Instead, it meant developing such a clear sense of his own values, capabilities, and worth that external opinions became interesting data rather than definitive judgments. This internal security created a paradoxical external effect. Because Marcus wasn't desperately seeking approval, people found themselves wanting to give it to him. Because he didn't need their validation, they valued his attention more highly. Because he was complete in himself, others felt drawn to his completeness. The transformation was now complete in its essential elements, though Marcus understood it would continue evolving throughout his life. He had systematically destroyed every aspect of his weak self and replaced those patterns with habits that created genuine magnetism. The man who looked back at him from the mirror now was someone he respected, someone he would want to know better, someone who couldn't be ignored even if others tried. But the most profound change wasn't in how others saw him, it was in how he saw himself. Marcus had discovered that becoming unignorable wasn't about manipulating others' perceptions but about developing such authentic strength, interest, and value that attention became a natural byproduct rather than a desperate goal. The conference room experience had crystallized this understanding. His colleagues weren't paying attention because he was demanding it or performing for it. They were engaged because he had something genuinely valuable to offer and the presence to offer it compellingly. He had become someone worth listening to, worth knowing, worth remembering. Yet as satisfying as this transformation had been, Marcus realized that true power, the kind that could never be taken away by others, required one more evolution. He needed to move beyond being unignorable to being indispensable. Beyond commanding attention to creating lasting impact. Beyond personal magnetism to meaningful contribution. The foundation was solid, the structure was sound, but the purpose remained to be fully realized. The resignation letter sat on Marcus's desk for 3 days before he submitted it. Not because he was uncertain about leaving, the decision felt inevitable now, but because he wanted to understand the full weight of what he was choosing. 2 years ago, he would have been terrified to leave a stable job. 6 months ago, he would have sought approval from everyone in his life before making such a significant change. Now, he was operating from a place of such internal certainty that external validation was unnecessary. The company's response to his resignation revealed the extent of his transformation. What had begun as an effort to become unignorable had evolved into something more profound. He had become indispensable. His manager requested a meeting with the department head. The department head scheduled time with the division president. They offered him a promotion, a significant salary increase, and the opportunity to lead a new initiative that had been in development for months. Marcus listened to each offer with genuine appreciation and gentle firmness. He had already accepted a position with a smaller organization where his impact would be more direct and more aligned with his evolving understanding of meaningful work. The decision wasn't about money or status, it was about the kind of person he was becoming and the kind of contribution he wanted to make to the world. This moment represented the final stage of transformation, moving from personal magnetism to purposeful impact. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not just because he has eliminated his vulnerabilities, but because he has built something so valuable, so aligned with his authentic self, and so beneficial to others that it transcends personal protection to become a genuine force for positive change. The journey from invisible to unignorable had taught Marcus that true power comes not from demanding attention but from deserving it. True security comes not from avoiding criticism but from being so grounded in authentic value that criticism becomes irrelevant. True influence comes not from manipulation but from embodying qualities that naturally inspire others to elevate their own standards. But the most important lesson had been this: becoming unignorable was never really about others' attention at all. It was about developing such clarity about his own worth, purpose, and contribution that others' opinions, positive or negative, became simply information rather than sources of identity validation or threat. Marcus reflected on how the 19 habits had evolved from conscious practices to unconscious characteristics. His posture now reflected genuine confidence rather than performed authority. His conversations emerged from authentic curiosity rather than strategic networking. His responses to challenges came from integrated wisdom rather than reactive defensiveness. The young man who had stared at his reflection 2 years ago, slouching and apologetic and forgettable, had been systematically replaced by someone who commanded respect without demanding it, who created value without announcing it, and who influenced others through the sheer force of authentic excellence rather than political maneuvering or social manipulation. This transformation had attracted opportunities that his previous self couldn't have imagined. Not just career advancement, but invitations to contribute to meaningful projects, requests to mentor younger professionals, and the chance to shape organizational culture in directions that align with his values. People sought his opinion not because he was the loudest voice in the room but because he had proven himself to be one of the most thoughtful. More importantly, the internal experience of living had fundamentally changed. Marcus woke each morning with a sense of purpose and possibility that his previous self had never experienced. Decision-making had become cleaner and faster because he knew who he was and what mattered to him. Relationships had deepened because he could offer genuine presence rather than desperate approval-seeking. The fear that had once driven most of his choices, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of not being liked, had been replaced by something much more sustainable, a clear understanding of his own value and a commitment to expressing that value authentically regardless of others' responses. This didn't mean he had become indifferent to others or disconnected from social feedback. Instead, he had developed what he thought of as conscious responsiveness, the ability to consider others' perspectives and needs while maintaining his own center. He could adapt his communication style to be more effective with different personality types without compromising his core principles. He could accept criticism that was valid and helpful while dismissing feedback that was more about the critic's issues than about his actual performance. The new position Marcus was accepting represented this integrated approach to professional development. Instead of choosing opportunities based on external markers of success or others' expectations, he had selected a role that aligned with his values, utilized his strengths, and offered the potential for meaningful impact. The organization worked with communities to develop sustainable economic initiatives, work that combined his analytical skills with his growing commitment to creating positive change. But perhaps the most significant shift was in his relationship to failure and setbacks. The weak self he had destroyed had been fragile precisely because it was built on others' approval and external validation. When that approval was withdrawn or when external circumstances changed dramatically, the entire structure would collapse. The self he had constructed was anti-fragile, it actually grew stronger under pressure. Challenges became opportunities to demonstrate resilience. Criticism became data for potential improvement. Setbacks became chances to practice the values and habits that defined his character. This wasn't positive thinking or denial, it was a fundamental reorientation toward difficulty as a tool for development rather than a threat to be avoided. Marcus remembered a conversation with his sister from the previous month. She had noticed the changes in him, not just the obvious improvements in confidence and presence, but something deeper. "You seem like yourself now," she had said. "Like the person you were always supposed to be was just waiting for you to stop being afraid of him." That observation had crystallized something important for Marcus. The transformation hadn't been about becoming someone different, it had been about becoming fully himself. The weak self he had destroyed wasn't his true self, it was a defensive construction built to avoid rejection and minimize risk. Underneath that protective layer had been someone with genuine strength, clear values, and meaningful contributions to offer. The 19 habits hadn't changed his fundamental nature, they had revealed it. They had stripped away the accumulated layers of fear, people-pleasing, and self-doubt that had obscured his authentic character. What emerged wasn't a performance or a persona but the clearest expression of who he actually was when freed from the need to manage others' perceptions. This realization had profound implications for how he approached relationships, work, and life decisions. Instead of asking what will others think, or how can I avoid rejection, he now asked what does this situation require from my authentic self, and how can I contribute most meaningfully here? These questions led to different choices. In relationships, he was more selective but more generous, choosing to invest deeply in connections that were mutually growth-oriented rather than trying to maintain surface-level pleasantness with everyone he encountered. In work, he was more strategic but more committed, taking on challenges that aligned with his values rather than simply advancing his career metrics. The cumulative effect was a life that felt both more demanding and more sustainable. More demanding because he held himself to higher standards and took on greater responsibilities. More sustainable because those standards and responsibilities emerged from his authentic values rather than external pressures. Marcus's departure from his previous company created a ripple effect that surprised him. 3 colleagues reached out to discuss their own career transitions. 2 asked if he would be willing to serve as a reference for positions they were considering. 1 requested regular mentoring conversations as she developed her own leadership capabilities. These requests reflected another aspect of becoming unignorable. People who transform themselves give others permission to attempt their own transformations. By demonstrating that significant change was possible, Marcus had become a source of inspiration and guidance for others who were tired of accepting mediocrity in their own lives. This influence wasn't something he had sought or actively cultivated. It was a natural byproduct of living with increasing authenticity and intention. When someone observes another person breaking through limitations they had assumed were permanent, it expands their sense of what might be possible for themselves. The mentoring conversations revealed another dimension of the transformation. Marcus found that he could help others identify and destroy their own weak selves not through advice or instruction but through asking the right questions and creating space for honest self-examination. His journey had taught him to recognize the signs of defensive mediocrity and the specific fears that kept people trapped in unfulfilling patterns. More importantly, he could model what it looked like to live from authentic strength rather than reactive protection. In his interactions with mentors, colleagues, and friends, he demonstrated what it meant to respond to challenges from a place of centered confidence rather than anxious defensiveness. The new position began 3 weeks after his final day at the previous company. The transition period had given Marcus time to reflect on how completely his relationship to work had changed. Instead of viewing his job as something he had to endure to pay bills and gain approval, he now saw it as an expression of his values and a vehicle for meaningful contribution. This shift in perspective made him more effective and more satisfied simultaneously. When work aligns with authentic values and utilizes genuine strengths, the traditional boundaries between personal and professional development dissolve. Growth in one area naturally supports growth in the other. The first team meeting at his new organization confirmed that he had made the right choice. The discussion focused on sustainable impact rather than quarterly metrics, on community benefit rather than purely financial returns, on long-term relationship building rather than short-term transaction optimization. These were conversations he could contribute to wholeheartedly because they reflected his own evolving understanding of meaningful work. But the meeting also revealed another aspect of his transformation that he hadn't fully anticipated. His colleagues looked to him for insights and perspectives almost immediately, despite his being the newest member of the team. His questions shaped the direction of planning conversations. His suggestions influenced strategic decisions. This immediate influence wasn't based on formal authority or political maneuvering. It emerged from the quality of his thinking, the clarity of his communication, and the obvious alignment between his personal values and the organization's mission. People trusted his judgment because his judgment had proven trustworthy in his previous contexts, and that reputation had preceded him. Marcus realized that he had achieved something more valuable than being unignorable. He had become undeniable. Not through force or manipulation, but through the accumulated weight of authentic excellence. When someone consistently demonstrates clear thinking, principled decision-making, and genuine concern for others' success, their influence becomes a natural consequence rather than a political achievement. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has built something that transcends personal protection. He has created value that extends beyond himself. He has developed capabilities that benefit others. He has aligned his actions with principles that don't depend on external validation for their worth. This doesn't mean he becomes invulnerable to all criticism or immune to all setbacks. It means that his core identity and sense of purpose are so grounded in authentic strength that external challenges become opportunities for demonstration rather than threats to survival. Marcus's journey from invisible to indispensable had taught him that true security comes not from avoiding vulnerability but from developing such genuine strength that vulnerability becomes manageable. True influence comes not from controlling others but from becoming so valuable that others seek to learn from your example. Most importantly, true freedom comes not from escaping all constraints but from choosing constraints that align with your deepest values and highest aspirations. The discipline required to destroy the weak self and build something magnificent in its place wasn't a limitation of freedom, it was the foundation of authentic liberation. As Marcus settled into his new role, he understood that the transformation would continue throughout his life. The 19 habits had become integrated patterns, but they would need to evolve and deepen as he encountered new challenges and opportunities. The man he was becoming would continue becoming, guided by the principles he had discovered and the practices he had developed. But he also knew that the fundamental shift had been completed. He would never again accept mediocrity as inevitable or allow fear to determine his choices. He had proven to himself that radical transformation was possible, that authentic strength was achievable, and that a life of genuine impact was within reach for anyone willing to do the difficult work of destroying their weak self and building something magnificent in its place. The mirror now showed him someone he respected completely, not because he was perfect, but because he was authentic. Not because he never failed, but because he learned from failure. Not because everyone liked him, but because he liked himself. The man looking back was unignorable not because he demanded attention, but because he deserved it.